By any definition, it's one of the most intense wars being fought anywhere on Earth. A conflict comparable to those in Ukraine or Sudan in terms of sheer destruction. Yet while Gaza may be one of the biggest wars currently taking place, it is also one of the most mysterious. Not in the sense that few are talking about it, the conflict dominates news coverage, but in the sense that even the most straightforward facts are bitterly disputed. And perhaps nothing causes so much ill feeling as the question of the war's death toll. Ever since Israel launched its military response to the slaughter on October the 7th, a simultaneous war of narratives has erupted in the media. On the one side are those who want to play down the extent of Gaza's suffering for political ends. On the other are those who have an interest in inflating the casualty figures. Caught in the middle, the truth can sometimes feel like it's getting crushed into nothing. Thankfully, though, there are still serious researchers out there. Researchers who perform painstaking work trying to assess Gaza's true death toll in a way that's free from spin and bias. Today, we're going to be filling you in on their findings. Glimpsed in the headlines, the numbers can look unbelievable. Over 40,500 Palestinians dead, according to the UN, with perhaps 10,000 missing under the rubble. Around 60% of all buildings in Gaza damaged or destroyed. Compared to other conflicts, these numbers are staggering. In its half-yearly report into global violence, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, recently described how, quoting here, Palestine witnessed 39,800 reported fatalities from July 2023 to the end of June 2024, displacing the previous most deadly conflict, Ukraine, where ACLED recorded more than 37,300 deaths in the same time period. Such sky-high figures are important beyond mere humanitarian reasons. They're part of the reason why Israel now faces two cases in international courts, one for war crimes, one for genocide. Yet for all their obvious salience, there's another intriguing aspect to these numbers. Almost no one can agree on whether they're even close to being right. And we don't just mean that the Israel Defense Forces and Hamas disagree on the number of people killed in Gaza. We mean that there's so much anger and misinformation swirling around this topic that sensible discourse just feels impossible. Hence why we decided to make this video. Not because we're qualified mortality statisticians, but because we think it's important to amplify the work of those who are. Researchers and statisticians who've attempted to approach this vital question as coolly and as dispassionately as possible. Recounting their findings is going to make up the bulk of this video. But first, there's something we need to quickly dive into: why it is currently so hard to get an accurate death toll. Now, that wasn't always the case. When Israel's bombardment began, the Palestinian Ministry of Health's Gaza branch, usually abbreviated to MOH, did what it had done in previous conflicts. It began releasing death tolls based on the bodies that passed through its morgue system. Although run by Hamas, the MOH's work in this area has been judged as reasonably accurate in previous wars. Royal Holloway expert and board member of violence tracking nonprofit Every Casualty Counts, Professor Mike Spaggett, has credited this to a simple and transparent system. Here is his explainer of how it worked. For each person killed, the MOH recorded the name, the age, the sex, and a national ID number. The national ID number is particularly important because these ID numbers are assigned by the Israeli authorities who maintain the Gazan population register. This meant Israel could check any name on the list to make sure it belonged to a real person, resulting in a mostly accurate count. And signs are that despite skepticism from US officials, that is exactly what happened when the war began in October 2023. The MOH logged bodies as normal and produced a fairly accurate death toll. And we know this because researchers from Johns Hopkins and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine ran separate studies on those early figures and found no evidence of inflated data into November. The nonprofit Air Wars also ran its own study, where it managed to verify most of the names on a sample list of 3,000. Clearly, the system used at the start of the conflict produced numbers that were reasonably on target, until suddenly they weren't. Toward the end of November 2023, the quality of data gathered by the MOH began to dip. The reason? The destruction of the Gazan healthcare system. At the beginning of October 2023, Gaza had 36 functioning hospitals. By mid-June 2024, The Guardian reports this number had plunged to 17. In their words, the rest were entirely destroyed. This destruction meant many bodies no longer passed through morgues. As early as December, 2 months into the war, the MOH seems to have recognized this was impacting the quality of their data. So they decided to supplement their morgue data with that from other sources. It would be this necessary decision, more than any other, that wound up creating such confusion over the true death toll. The idea that a war might be so destructive that counting bodies becomes impossible It's not new. As a result, there are some well-established alternative methods for assessing an ongoing conflict's death toll, one of which is to use reports found in reputable media. This is one of the methods the MOH adopted to combat the lack of data from destroyed hospitals. The Economist states that the first media-sourced casualty figures began appearing in the death counts in mid-November of 2023. Now, this in and of itself is not a problem. As every casualty counts as written, quoting here, media monitoring is a perfectly respectable way of monitoring recorded deaths in armed conflict. Lots of organizations do this all around the world. Now, one current example is the joint count the BBC and independent Russian outlet Mediazona are undertaking into the true cost of the Ukraine war. Along with other methods like visiting graveyards and war memorials, the team monitors local Russian media for obituary notices. However, what makes the BBC Mediazona count so respected is that it is incredibly transparent in its methodology. It's also extremely stringent, and it has to be. To avoid duplications, vast teams are required to process data and double and triple check every single name. It's the sort of thing you need endless determination and a BBC-sized newsroom to do well. Unfortunately, the Gazan MOH keeps its media sourcing methods opaque. Here's how Every Casualty Counts explains it. To assess the reliability of this revised system, we would need to know what methodology the MOH uses to record deaths from media sources. We also need to see a database containing these reported deaths and the sources that report them. Unfortunately, this information has not been made public. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean the MOH figures are bunkum. They could very well be using methodology every bit as rigorous as the BBC uses for its Russian casualty figures. In that case, we'd expect to find a small number of duplications, but a list that is otherwise pretty solid. The trouble is that we don't know this for a fact. Unless the datasets are released, there will always be a question mark hanging over some of these figures, and that goes likewise for the publicly reported fatalities. At the same time that it began using media sources, the MOH also created a process for people to register the death of family members simply by filling out an online form. The logic was that this would capture casualties lost under rubble or otherwise unreported. But combined with the use of media reports, it also opened the door to repeated instances of double counting. To see the impact these changes have had, The Economist looked at data from April the 30th. By that day, the cumulative number of dead recorded through the morgue system was slightly over 20,000. Adding on the deaths from the media reports took the figure to far over 30,000. With the publicly reported fatalities, the number closed in on 40,000. And again, we need to be absolutely upfront about the fact that these figures may still be accurate. The point of this section is not to utterly dismiss the MOH's data. It's simply to say that without the transparent release of data sets and methodology, no one can prove their figures right or wrong. It's the same claims relating to the number of civilians killed in the conflict. If you've been following this war, you may be aware that there was a huge controversy with the UN revising its civilian death toll downwards earlier this year. Many took that as proof that the MOH's figures were flawed and the UN was foolish for using them. But while foolish, the UN wasn't only using MOH figures. It was using them combined with a ratio of civilian dead provided by Gaza's government media office to come up with its own numbers. That was a dumb thing to do because the GMO is literally a Hamas propaganda department. While the MOH has a track record in previous conflicts of reasonable accuracy, the GMO and accuracy should not be used in the same sentence. Since October of 2023, for example, the GMO has claimed that 70% of the Gazan dead are women and children. Initially, that was close to the truth. In the first weeks, the MOH list of the dead was nearly 64% women and children. Since then, though, the figure has sharply fallen. In June, an AP News analyst reported here via PBS showed that the real number today is likely closer to 38%. The UN, though, long continued to use the 70% figure. In doing so, it discredited MOH data in the eyes of millions who wrongly assumed the Ministry of Health was responsible for the ratio. And that's a real shame, because as we are about to see, the MOH does sporadically release a set of data that can be taken as a good baseline for those killed in the war. Known as the named list, it may be the closest we have to a minimum casualty count. Although it publishes a new death toll every day, the MOH releases its data only every now and then. For example, a release in January was followed by one in late March, then one in early May, and then another in late June, and so on. When it does release these datasets, though, it always constitutes a significant moment. That's because a list of the named dead is among the items made public. Complete with birth dates and ID numbers, it allows researchers to evaluate if the count is reasonably accurate. So far, the answer appears to be that it is. As such, the named list may represent a good starting point for understanding the bare minimum killed in the Gaza War. Now, that's not to say that the list is perfect by any means. Recent updates have included deaths reported by family members via online forums, as well as those processed by hospitals and morgues. This could potentially lead to some instances of duplication. A bigger problem is that several of the entities are obviously flawed. A whole bunch of names have been listed with invalid ID numbers that feature one number too few or one number too many. Now, that could easily be due to grieving relatives or overworked doctors accidentally copying things incorrectly in a stressful situation. Far weirder are the 1,000 or so ID numbers that don't match the way these numbers appear in real life. Every Casualty Counts explains it this way. Most of these were invalid IDs beginning with 8046, which could potentially be placeholder ID numbers for people whom the MOH doesn't have the correct number. We don't know. As with so much in this video, we would be better able to judge things if the MOH simply started being more transparent with its methods. But since that has yet to happen, multiple sources have instead invested time and energy into assessing the named list's accuracy. Now, despite some obviously flawed entries, the key takeaway appears to be that it's doing a good job. The Economist, for example, conducted an analysis in late April and found that 84% of the entries were valid, with real ID numbers. The periodical also got to access an Israel Defense Forces analysis of the list from January. The IDF concluded that 83% of the entries on that list were real people. Professor Mike Spaggett of Royal Holloway University also came up with a similar figure in a March analysis, concluding that 84% were likely real. Summarizing the findings, he was quoted as saying, "Yes, there needs to be more work on the data, but it is still a good, largely transparent system. All subsequent work on the death toll of the war will build on this foundation." Other organizations that trust these lists are the World Health Organization and Human Rights Watch. As The Economist wrote in their article, quote, "In other words, while not all entries on the named list are complete, there is good reason to believe those on it are dead." The last time the list was released in full, at least at the time of writing, there were 28,185 entries on there. By late August, that figure had risen to 32,280, although without the data release that would allow researchers to verify the newest casualties. As such, we can probably take 28,185 as our absolute minimum baseline for wartime deaths in Gaza. Bear in mind, this figure does not differentiate between civilians and Hamas militants, another source of controversy. While Hamas boasted in April that only 6,000 of its fighters had died, by June the Israelis were claiming to have killed 15,000. Given that neither side provided evidence, it's hard to say how much of our baseline figure might therefore be made up of combatants. Either way, it still represents a staggering number. During 2014, Gaza conflict, previously the 21st century's deadliest clash in the Strip, somewhere in the region of 2,300 Palestinians were killed. Even at its lowest count then, the current Gaza War has a death toll that is orders of magnitude greater. Yet this figure of 28,000 is merely a baseline. Others think the true death toll may be far, far higher. And yes, it's time we analyse perhaps the most controversial death toll of all, the Lancet letter that claimed an unimaginable 186,000 may have died. Now, the Lancet is one of the most respected medical journals in the world. For a study to appear within its pages, it has to go through a rigorous peer review process that excels at rooting out bad methodology. However, the same is not true of the Lancet's correspondence section. While they only publish letters from real experts, they do not require them to undergo any sort of peer review. We mention this because misunderstanding this basic fact has led to some incredibly skewed coverage of the Gaza letter published on July the 20th. Written by Rasha Khatib, Martin McKee, and Salim Yusuf, it suggested that a jaw-dropping 186,000 deaths may be attributed to the conflict once indirect deaths are also counted. Rather than give this explosive figure within its proper context, though, a lot of media either ran with it as gospel truth or else completely dismissed it due to the lack of peer review. And that's unfortunate because, whatever else it may be, the letter is an expert view given by 3 respected researchers. As such, their claims, as well as counterclaims by other experts, deserve to be listened to. At the crux of the writer's figure is the phenomenon of indirect deaths. That is, those who die not due to an armed conflict, but because of the conditions the conflict creates. So, you might include those who die of disease because the healthcare system has collapsed, or those who slowly starve because of lack of access to food. Such deaths are not unique to the Gaza War. The 2020 to 2022 Tigray War in Ethiopia, for example, became this century's deadliest conflict, not due to the intensity of fighting, but because a government blockade triggered a famine that may have killed hundreds of thousands. Or you could look at the conflict in East Timor between 1974 and 1999, where researchers have estimated 84,000 died due to displacement and starvation, compared to 19,000 killed in the actual fighting. Such examples form the backbone of the Lancet letter's argument. Using 13 recent wars, the researchers estimate that, quote, in recent conflicts, conflicts, such indirect deaths range from 3 to 15 times the number of direct deaths. They then take what they call the conservative estimate of 4 direct deaths per every direct death and use figures reported by the MOH to estimate what the true death toll in Gaza might be. In their words, it is not implausible to estimate that up to 186,000 or even more deaths could be attributable to the current conflict in Gaza. If true, this would make Gaza, with the possible exception of Ukraine, the deadliest conflict happening anywhere on Earth. Even Sudan, where 150,000 people are estimated to have died, would pale in comparison, and that is just in overall numbers. As a percentage, 186,000 would translate to nearly 8% of Gaza's pre-war population. Not even the bloodiest estimates suggest that even 1% of Ukraine or Sudan's populations have died in their respective conflicts. As The Guardian reports in an interview with co-author Rasha Khatib, quote, Khatib fears that the war in Gaza could have the highest indirect death rate of any conflict in recent history, and the figures published in the Lancet letter are conservative. The scary part may be that some NGOs on the ground in Gaza find these figures plausible. France 24 interviewed President of Doctors of the World Jean-François Courtet, who declared, quote, the death toll of 186,000 mentioned in the Lancet is consistent with the health, military, and geopolitical situation due to the sea, air, and land blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip. Pointing to the lack of hospitals and the general lack of healthcare, Courtet later added, quote, if you add those who are likely to die of malnutrition or as a result of wounds inflicted by Israeli bombardments in the weeks and months to come, then yes, the figure of 186,000 deaths mentioned in the Lancet is credible. That is a terrifying endorsement, and it points to a major reason why the Lancet letter set the world's media ablaze. If true, it would suggest that Gaza is comparable only to the Tigray War in terms of suffering unleashed in this century. But that's a big if. As we're about to see, not everyone was convinced by the letter's findings. For some experts, the 186,000 figure was less a realistic count and more an example of the wild speculation this conflict seems to attract. Back in February, epidemiologists at Johns Hopkins University and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine unveiled a model predicting how many would die in Gaza. The model ran 3 scenarios: one where a ceasefire was put in place, one where the war escalated, and one where the conflict remained at the same tempo. The results were terrifying. According to the model, if the conflict continued as it had up to that point, there would be an additional 58,260 deaths by August of 2024. On top of the 30,000 or so already reported dead by February, it pointed to a looming catastrophe. Well, here we are, with August in the rear-view mirror, and it's clear that the model was wrong. While fighting did continue at a similar tempo, the MOH reported only 9,000 deaths over that time period. The model was out by a factor of 6. And we mention this because it shows how tricky it can be to model health outcomes in a chaotic situation. Had an epidemic taken hold amidst the rubble, or had the famine many were predicting occurred, then maybe the 58,000 figure would have come to pass. But the fact remains that it didn't. And there's no reason to assume the figures in the Lancet letter will fare any better. Writing for the British charity Action on Armed Violence, or AOAV, Professor Mike Spaggott has highlighted various areas where he believes the letter makes flawed assumptions. A major one is the use of the conservative 4-to-1 ratio for indirect deaths. As the professor writes, this ratio is plucked from Table 2.3 in the Global Burden of Armed Violence report that lists ratios of indirect to direct deaths ranging from 0 to 15.7 for 13 wars. However, these figures come from a small, non-representative sample of conflicts, many of which differ significantly from Gaza in terms of geography, accessibility, and humanitarian conditions. Among those differences he cites are the density of the Gaza Strip and the sheer amount of international attention focused on the conflict. As Spaggott writes, the focus can potentially mitigate the worst outcomes seen in more isolated conflicts. Despite Israeli restrictions, humanitarian aid efforts continue, and the international scrutiny may influence the delivery and effectiveness of aid. This is why we mentioned the Johns Hopkins model at the start of this chapter. The people building that model weren't idiots. They were experts working with a reasonable assumption that epidemic and famine might become part of the Gaza story, since they featured in so many other conflicts. The fact they didn't shows that it's hard to use other conflicts as a model for what will happen in the Gaza War. As Professor Spaggott told the New York Times, for example, although humanitarian agencies are warning of catastrophic levels of hunger, there is little evidence of widespread deaths because of starvation. This means using a 4-to-1 ratio, as the Lancet letter did, may not make much sense. The East Timor conflict, which did feature a similar ratio, was very different to the fighting in Gaza today. Just because the indirect deaths fell into a neat pattern, that doesn't mean they will in 2024. Or as Professor Spaggott put it, the lack of context-specific evidence in the article makes the application of a 4-to-1 ratio to Gaza speculative at best. Now, for his part, the professor seems to think that the final death toll is likely to be large, but nowhere near the 186,000 number. Writing for Every Casualty Counts, he laid out his own feelings this way. I would expect the final true number of people killed in the conflict to be in line with the figures being cited by the MOH, plus or minus 5,000 deaths. Given the MOH is currently reporting around 40,000 dead, that means that if the war stopped today, Professor Spaggett would expect to see a death toll of anywhere between 35 and 45,000. Even at the lower ends, that's still an astonishing number, equivalent to around 1.63% of Gaza's pre-war population. To put that in context, the Sudan war would have had to kill over 760,000 people to eliminate 1.63% of the country's population of 46.87 million. So far, it's estimated to have killed 150,000, or around 0.32%. And Sudan is one of the biggest, most destructive wars raging anywhere on Earth. At the end of all that, then, we can likely conclude a few things. One, that the MOH named list is the closest we currently have to a reasonable minimum baseline for deaths, despite some notable flaws. Two, that while we may have a pretty good grasp of the death toll's likely lower bounds, there is no way of knowing how many of the dead are civilians and how many are combatants. And three, that a lot of the current mysteries swirling around the toll could be improved by the MOH being more transparent with their data. But regardless of how credible we find the media-sourced and publicly reported deaths, the fact remains that even the named list death toll alone is still incredibly high, far in excess of any previous modern conflict seen in Gaza. And crucially, the war is still not over. While Every Casualty Counts reports that the tempo of daily deaths has dropped from an average of 400 in the conflict's opening months to roughly 100 today, that's still a lot of lives being lost. Exactly how Gaza can ever hope to recover is a question with profound implications for the future. But it's also a question for another day. For now, we hope we've succeeded in our small attempt to shine some light on this most contentious of topics, to at least point you in the direction of some reliable sources for assessing the war's death toll. Because make no mistake, figuring out the real number of dead in Gaza is crucial for ever hoping to understand the meaning of this conflict. A conflict that remains one of the most charged and divisive the world has seen in decades.